You may have heard of Truman Capote's Swans. They were his flock of impossibly chic and powerful female friends who ruled the social world of New York and Paris. Women like Babe Paley and Slim Keith, beautiful, graceful, and serene. But there was another woman who moved in their orbit, a figure of such dazzling style and such terrifying charisma that even Capote, a man who adored society's beautiful creatures, kept his distance. Her name was Daisy Fellows. And when Capote was asked why this supreme style icon wasn't part of his inner circle, his answer was chilling. He said she was, quite simply, too dangerous to be a swan. What does it mean to be too dangerous for a world already filled with sharks and sycophants? Daisy Fellows was an heiress to the colossal singer sewing machine fortune. Vogue magazine would famously declare her the best-dressed woman in the world, a title she held with an iron fist. She was a novelist, a poet, a magazine editor, and a jewelry designer who inspired masterpieces from Cartier. But she was also known for her breathtaking arrogance, her casual cruelty, and a heart that many whispered was as cold and as perfectly cut as the diamonds she wore. Her life is a story of sublime surfaces and dark, damaged depths. It's a journey that takes us from the last decadent days of La Belle Époque Paris, through the hedonistic chaos of the Jazz Age, to the horrifying moral compromises of the Second World War. To understand this beautiful, dangerous creature, we must peel back the layers of haute couture and unravel the story of a wounded little girl who grew up to become the uncrowned queen of Paris, a woman who conquered the world of style, but may have lost her soul in the process. To truly understand the creature that was Daisy Fellows, you must first understand the extraordinary and deeply contradictory world that created her. She was born in 1890 into the glittering twilight years of a period the French called La Belle Époque, the beautiful era. It was a time between the humiliating defeat of the Franco-Prussian War and the looming catastrophe of the First World War, when Paris was, without question, the capital of the civilized world. It was a city high on a cocktail of industrial progress, artistic revolution, and a frantic pursuit of pleasure. This was the Paris of the Impressionists, where artists like Monet and Renoir were redefining the very act of seeing. It was the Paris of the Moulin Rouge, of cancan dancers, and absinthe-fueled nights in Montmartre. It was the Paris of scientific marvels, where Marie Curie was conducting her Nobel Prize-winning research into radioactivity. And at its apex, it was a city with a high society so lavish, so intricate, and so obsessed with itself that it seemed to exist in a different reality. This society was a fascinating and often vicious battlefield between two great powers, the old world and the new. On one side, you had the ancient French aristocracy, the families of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, whose titles stretched back to the Crusades. Their power was based on blood, land, tradition, and an unshakable belief in their own innate superiority. On the other side, you had the new titans of industry and finance, the nouveau riche, who had amassed staggering fortunes from railways, steel, banking, and, in Daisy's case, the humble yet revolutionary sewing machine. Daisy was the product of a perfect symbolic union between these two worlds. Her father was Jean-Élie Octave Louis Sévère Amanieu, the third Duc des Cazes et de Glucksburg. He was the epitome of the French aristocrat of his time, charming, exquisitely mannered, possessed of a magnificent title, and chronically short of the cash required to maintain his lavish lifestyle. Her mother was Isabelle Blanche Singer, and she was anything but short of cash. She was the daughter of the legendary Isaac Merritt Singer. To call Isaac Singer a mere inventor is to do him a disservice. He was a force of nature, a classic American character who was part genius, part showman, and part scoundrel. He didn't invent the sewing machine, but he perfected it. And more importantly, he figured out how to sell it to the world. He introduced the installment plan, making his machine affordable to millions of ordinary families. He was a pioneer of global marketing, and he built one of the first true multinational corporations. He was also a man of gargantuan appetites, a flamboyant bigamist who fathered at least 24 children with a variety of wives and mistresses. When he died in 1875, he left behind a fortune so vast it was almost impossible to comprehend, a river of gold that would flow down through the generations. Isabelle Blanche was one of the principal heiresses to this river of gold. Her marriage to the Duc de Cazes was the ultimate Gilded Age transaction, American cash for a French title. It was a deal that propped up a declining aristocracy and gave a new industrial dynasty the stamp of ancient legitimacy. Into this union of immense wealth and immense prestige, on August 29, 1890, Marguerite Séverine Philippine de Cazes de Glucksberg was born. She would later discard these cumbersome names for the simple, elegant, and thoroughly modern moniker, Daisy. She was born into a world of almost unimaginable privilege. Her childhood was spent in grand Parisian hotels particuliers and magnificent chateaux. She was a child for whom every door was open, every desire attainable. She was destined for a life of balls, yachts, jewels, and a place at the absolute pinnacle of the social pyramid. But this perfect gilded world was built on a foundation of deep unhappiness, and it was about to be shattered by a tragedy so profound it would leave a wound that would fester for a lifetime. Daisy's mother, Isabelle Blanche, the beautiful heiress who seemed to have everything a woman could want, was a deeply unhappy soul. The fairy tale marriage to the French Duke was, in reality, a cold and lonely prison. The Duke, having secured her fortune, continued his life as a notorious philanderer. His constant and public affairs were a source of deep pain and humiliation for his wife. Trapped in a gilded cage, Isabelle Blanche sank into a profound and isolating depression. Then, in 1896, the final act of this private tragedy unfolded. The Duke, having fallen in love with a younger woman, essentially abandoned his wife and children. For Isabelle Blanche, this was the final unbearable blow to her pride and her heart. On a cold winter's day in Paris, she took her own life. Imagine for a moment the impact of this event on a 6-year-old child. The sudden, violent, and utterly incomprehensible disappearance of a mother. The world, once so safe and predictable, is suddenly a place of terrifying silence, of hushed whispers among the servants, of somber, unfamiliar faces. In that era, suicide was not just a tragedy. It was a profound scandal, a source of deep family shame that was often hidden away behind a wall of euphemisms. It is almost certain that the young Daisy was never given a clear or honest explanation of what had happened to her mother. All she knew was that her mother was gone, and that her father, the man who was supposed to be her protector, was somehow to blame. This early catastrophic trauma is the absolute key to understanding the woman Daisy Fellows would become. It was the primal wound that would shape her entire personality. It likely instilled in her a deep-seated cynical belief that love was an illusion, that intimacy led to pain, and that people, especially men, would inevitably abandon you. It may have been the source of her famous emotional coldness, a suit of psychological armor she built around a terrified and abandoned child's heart. And it almost certainly fueled a lifelong, insatiable, and often pathological need for control. If she could control her appearance, her environment, her social circle. If she could make herself so perfect and so powerful that no one could ever leave her, then perhaps she could never be hurt again. Her father, the Duke, proved to be as absent in the aftermath as he had been before. The task of raising the orphan Daisy and her siblings fell to her maternal aunt, a woman who was, in her own right, one of the most formidable and unconventional figures of the age, Winnaretta Singer, the Princess de Polignac. Winnaretta was another of the great singer heiresses, but she could not have been more different from her tragic sister. She was a brilliant intellectual, a gifted musician and painter, and arguably the most important female patron of the arts in the 20th century. Her legendary salon in Paris was the epicenter of the city's avant-garde cultural life. An invitation to one of her gatherings was a summons to the high church of modernism. Here, one could find composers like Igor Stravinsky, Erik Satie, and Gabriel Fauré premiering new works, often commissioned by Winnaretta herself. Writers like Marcel Proust and Jean Cocteau were regular attendees, as were dancers from the Ballet Russe and artists from every discipline. Winnaretta was also, and this was an open secret in Parisian society, a lesbian. Her marriage to the Prince de Polignac was what was known as a mariage blanc, or a lavender marriage, a union of convenience that provided her with an aristocratic title and a respectable social cover, while allowing both her and her homosexual husband the freedom to pursue their own private lives. In this deeply unconventional, intellectually supercharged, and emotionally cool household, the young Daisy was raised. It was a strange and contradictory upbringing. On the one hand, it nurtured her innate intelligence and her artistic sensibility. She grew up surrounded by genius. She developed a keen eye for beauty, a love for the new and the daring, and a sharp, witty intellect that could hold its own in any conversation. She learned that art was not just a decoration, but a serious, vital force in the world. On the other hand, the emotional landscape of her childhood remained a barren one. Winnaretta was a brilliant patron of the arts, but she was not a warm, maternal figure. Daisy grew up surrounded by the greatest creative minds of her time, but she was likely starved of simple, uncomplicated affection. This upbringing reinforced the lessons of her mother's death, that the world of emotions was dangerous and unreliable, but the world of art, style, and intellect was a place where one could create order, beauty, and control. It was here that the future Daisy Fellows, the cold, brilliant dictator of style, was truly born. As Daisy emerged from her unconventional childhood and into womanhood, the path laid out for her was, on the surface, the traditional one for a young woman of her immense class and fortune. A suitable, advantageous marriage was not just an expectation, it was a dynastic necessity. In 1910, at the age of 19, a perfect match was made. She was married to Prince Jean-Amédée Marie Anatole de Broglie. This was no small alliance. The de Broglie family was one of the grandest and most distinguished in all of France. They were an ancient line of Italian origin that had entered French service in the 17th century and had since produced a seemingly endless stream of marshals, diplomats, statesmen, and even a prime minister. To marry a de Broglie was to marry into the very heart of the French establishment. For Daisy, this union was a final, definitive step. It fused her colossal American industrial fortune with the unimpeachable prestige of the old French aristocracy. Her life as the young Princess de Broglie was, for a few brief years, a whirlwind of the kind of social activity that defined La Belle Époque. There were balls in Paris, weekends at magnificent country chateaux, summers in Deauville, and winters in the south of France. It was a life of almost theatrical luxury, and Daisy, with her beauty, wit, and immense wealth, quickly became a leading figure in the younger generation of Parisian society. It was during this time that she began to build her own family, the stable traditional family unit that had been so brutally taken from her as a child. With Prince Jean, she had 3 daughters: Emmeline, born in 1911, Isabel in 1912, and Jacqueline in 1918. She had recreated the structure of a perfect aristocratic life. She was a princess, a wife, and a mother. It seemed for a moment that she had successfully outrun the ghosts of her past. But while the music played on in the ballrooms of Paris, the world outside was marching towards a cataclysm. The intricate system of alliances and imperial rivalries that had defined Europe for decades was about to unravel with horrifying speed. In August 1914, after the assassination of an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo, the great powers of Europe declared war on one another. The beautiful era was over. The Great War had begun. For the French aristocracy, the outbreak of war was met with a surge of patriotic fervor. This was a chance to avenge the humiliating defeat of 1870 and to reclaim the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine from Germany. Prince Jean de Broglie, like nearly every able-bodied man of his class, immediately enlisted to fight for his country. He served as a soldier on the Western Front, the bloodiest and most brutal theater of the war. For 4 years, Daisy was a war wife. She remained in Paris with her young children, living through the strange, tense atmosphere of a capital at war. She would have experienced the Zeppelin raids, the food shortages, and the constant, gnawing anxiety of waiting for news from the front. She, like millions of other women, would have read the casualty lists with a sense of dread, lists that grew longer and longer as the war devolved into the static, industrialized slaughter of trench warfare. Then in 1918, in the final chaotic months of the conflict, the news she had been dreading finally arrived. Prince Jean de Broglie had been killed in action. At the age of just 28, Daisy was a widow. The man who had given her a place at the heart of French society was gone. She was now solely responsible for her 3 young daughters and for the management of 2 immense fortunes, her own Singer inheritance and the de Broglie estate she now controlled. She had experienced more loss and trauma in her first 3 decades than most people do in a lifetime. The suicide of her mother, the emotional abandonment of her father, and now the death of her husband in a war that had shattered the world. These experiences did not break her, they hardened her. They calcified her already cynical view of the world. They forged the beautiful, wounded heiress into a woman of formidable and often terrifying resilience. She had learned the hardest lesson the world can teach over and over again, that everything you love can be taken from you in an instant. The only things that were permanent, the only things you could truly rely on were money and your own indomitable will to survive. The world that emerged from the rubble of the First World War was a place of ghosts. An entire generation of young men was gone. The great empires of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, and the Ottomans had all collapsed. The old rules, the old certainties were gone forever. In their place came a new, frantic, and liberated culture. This was the beginning of the Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties. It was a world of shocking new art forms, like surrealism and cubism, of the liberated flapper with her short skirts and bobbed hair, of wild, non-stop parties, fueled by cocktails, and a desperate desire to forget the horrors of the war. For a young, beautiful, and fantastically wealthy widow like Daisy, this new world was a playground. She was now free from the constraints of her aristocratic French marriage. She had the money and the status to do whatever she wanted with whomever she wanted, and she made a decision that would redefine her life. She left the somber, war-scarred atmosphere of Paris and reinvented herself in London. London in the Roaring Twenties was a city in the grip of a hedonistic fever. It was the world of the bright young things, a generation of young aristocrats, artists, and socialites who dedicated themselves to a life of outrageous parties, treasure hunts through the city at midnight, and a constant public performance of their own fabulousness. Daisy, with her French title, her American fortune, her sharp wit, and her tragic romantic backstory as a war widow, plunged into this world and quickly rose to become one of its reigning queens. It was in London that she met her second husband, the Honorable Reginald Reggie Aylwin Fellows. Reggie was the quintessential English insider. He was a war hero who had been awarded the Military Cross. He was a successful banker, and he was deeply connected. His mother was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary, and he was a cousin of Winston Churchill. He was wealthy, but his fortune was nothing compared to Daisy's. Their marriage in 1919 was a major society event. For Daisy, it was a brilliant strategic move. It solidified her position at the very center of British high society and gave her a respectable, stable, and conveniently placid English husband. For Reggie, the marriage brought access to his wife's colossal fortune, which would fund their incredibly lavish lifestyle for the next 3 decades. It was, by all accounts, a marriage based not on passionate love, but on a cool, mutual understanding. With Reggie, Daisy had her fourth and final child, a daughter named Rosamond, who was born in 1921. She now had a new husband, a new home, and a new life. But domesticity was never going to be enough for Daisy. The 1920s and 30s were the decades in which she truly came into her own, not as a wife or a mother, but as a singular force of nature in the world of what was then called the international set. She had survived the wreckage of the old world, and she was now determined to be the queen of the new one. With her marriage to Reggie Fellows, Daisy had secured her position. She was now a permanent fixture at the very apex of both London and Parisian society. But she was never content to simply be a part of a world. She had to dominate it. The 2 decades between the world wars were the years of her imperial reign. She was not a queen of a country, but of a far more exclusive and elusive kingdom, the international set. This was a new kind of society, a nomadic tribe of the fantastically wealthy, the titled and the talented who moved in a perpetual glittering migration between the great capitals and resorts of Europe. A season in London for the debutante balls and the horse races at Ascot, then to Paris for the haute couture collections, summers cruising the Mediterranean, and winters skiing in St. Moritz. It was a life of almost unimaginable luxury, a world completely insulated from the economic hardships and political anxieties that were gripping the rest of the world. And Daisy Fellows was its undisputed empress. She and Reggie became the ultimate power couple, maintaining a collection of magnificent homes that served as the stages for her social theater. There was their elegant house in Mayfair, London, a hub for the British political and social elite. There was a chic, modern apartment in Paris on the fashionable Rue de Lille. And there was her legendary villa, Les Zoraïdes, in Cap Martin, on the French Riviera, a lavishly renovated palace that became the epicenter of summer society. But Daisy's true kingdom, the place where her power was most absolute, was her magnificent yacht, a sleek, black-hulled vessel named the Sister Anne. The Sister Anne was her floating salon, her mobile court. Throughout the summer, she would cruise the Mediterranean from the Greek islands to the coast of Italy, and an invitation to join her was the most coveted social prize of the year. Her guest lists were a masterful exercise in power broking, a carefully curated mix of the influential, the famous, and the beautiful. On any given week, the deck of the Sister Anne might be graced by royalty, like the controversial Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who were close friends. Politicians like Winston Churchill, her husband's cousin, would be there, deep in conversation with powerful newspaper magnates. Writers like Noel Coward and Evelyn Waugh would be observing the scene, gathering material for their next play or novel. And artists, designers, and film stars would add a dash of bohemian glamour. Life on board was a world of pure, unadulterated luxury, managed by a flawless crew. But it was ruled with an iron fist by Daisy herself. She was a notoriously demanding and often cruel hostess. Guests were not invited to relax. They were invited to perform. They were expected to be amusing, witty, and impeccably dressed at all times. One slip-up, one boring anecdote at dinner, and you could find yourself unceremoniously dropped off at the next port of call with your luggage on the quay. Her cruelty was legendary, an art form she practiced with a chilling sense of detachment. She had a gift for the bon mot, the perfectly crafted, devastatingly witty insult, which she deployed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She seemed to take a particular, almost sadistic pleasure in humiliating those she perceived as weak, boring, or socially inferior. Cecil Beaton, the photographer and diarist, who was both fascinated and terrified by her, recorded many of these instances. He wrote of how she once invited a famously dull but very wealthy man on one of her yachting parties. For days she was impeccably polite to him. Then on the final night, as the yacht was moored in a glamorous port, she turned to him at the dinner table in front of all of the other guests and said in a clear, caring voice, "We've all been trying to figure it out. Why exactly are you, Tosha, here?" It was this combination of breathtaking glamour and casual psychological brutality that made her both feared and endlessly fascinating. People were desperate for her approval and terrified of her scorn. To be in her inner circle was to be at the center of the world. To be cast out was social death. Her personal life was just as audacious and defiant of convention. Her marriage to Reggie Fellows was a famously open one. He was a quiet, conventional man who seemed content to live in the shadow of his dazzling, difficult wife. He tolerated her numerous affairs, which she conducted with a flagrant disregard for discretion. Her most serious and public affair was with Alfred Duff Cooper, a rising star in the British Conservative Party, a war hero, a brilliant writer, and a future cabinet minister and ambassador to France. The problem was that Duff Cooper was married to Lady Diana Manners, herself a legendary beauty and one of the most beloved figures in English society. The affair between Daisy and Duff Cooper was an open secret, a source of endless gossip on 2 continents, and a source of profound pain for Lady Diana. But Daisy seemed to thrive on the drama, on the sense of conquest. She was not a woman who would ever allow another woman, not even one as admired as Lady Diana, to stand in her way. It was during these years that she also began to cultivate her intellectual and artistic side. She was not just a clothes horse or a hostess. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and creative talent. She wrote 2 novels, the best known of which was Les Dimanches de la Comtesse de Narbonne, The Sundays of the Countess of Narbonne, published in 1937. She also wrote poetry, which she would occasionally publish in literary journals. Her writing was much like her personal style, sharp, modernist, and emotionally detached. It revealed a keen observational eye and a cynical, often melancholic view of the world. This was the complete picture of Daisy Fellows at the height of her powers. She was a tastemaker, a hostess, a writer, a seductress. She had meticulously constructed a life that was a perfect, impenetrable fortress of style, wealth, and power. She had achieved a level of social dominance that few have ever equaled. But this fortress was built to protect a deeply wounded core, and the cruelty she wielded was the weapon she used to keep the world at bay. She was the queen of the international set, but her reign was a reign of terror, and her court was a place of dangerous, glittering beauty. By the 1930s, Daisy Fellows was more than just a rich woman who bought expensive clothes. She had become a global fashion icon, a high priestess of style whose every choice was watched, analyzed, and imitated by women around the world. What made her style so profoundly influential? It wasn't just that she had access to the best designers, it was her absolute, fearless, and often shocking audacity. In an era when many society women aimed for a look that was simply pretty, romantic, or conventionally elegant, Daisy aimed for something far more challenging. She wanted to be modern. She wanted to be a walking work of art. She wanted to be chic, a word she practically defined for her generation. The essence of her style was a rejection of soft, fussy femininity. It was sharp, severe, architectural, and intensely intelligent. She had a boyishly slim, almost androgynous figure, a silhouette she maintained with a famously disciplined diet, and she chose clothes that accentuated this modern form. She favored clean lines, bold, almost minimalist silhouettes, and a largely monochromatic palette of black, white, and navy blue, often punctuated with a single shocking splash of color. She understood the power of simplicity, the idea that true elegance comes from stripping away the unnecessary. She became a muse, a collaborator, and a close friend to the two most revolutionary fashion designers of the 20th century, who were themselves bitter and legendary rivals, Gabrielle Coco Chanel and Elsa Schiaparelli. The fact that she could not only wear but embody the starkly different aesthetics of these two geniuses is the ultimate testament to her mastery of style. With Chanel, she shared a love for a chic, understated, and liberated modernism. Daisy was one of the first women to truly understand the revolutionary power of Chanel's little black dress. She saw that it wasn't just a garment, it was a statement of independence. She wore Chanel's comfortable, elegant jersey suits and her signature ropes of fake pearls with an unmatched sense of casual, aristocratic ease. She embodied the Chanel ideal of a woman who was elegant but also active and free. But it was with Elsa Schiaparelli that her true avant-garde spirit found its most perfect and outrageous match. Schiap, as she was known, was the surrealist of fashion, a designer who saw clothes not just as coverings, but as a medium for art, wit, and provocation. She collaborated with artists like Salvador Dali and Jean Cocteau. Her clothes were conversation pieces designed to shock and delight. She created the shoe hat, a hat shaped like an upside-down high heel, the lobster dress, a white silk evening gown with a giant red lobster painted on it by Dali, and suits with pockets shaped like drawers. Most society women were too timid to wear such strange and wonderful creations. But Daisy was completely fearless. She would wear a Schiaparelli shoe hat to a formal luncheon with the same unshakable conviction as if it were a simple string of pearls. She understood the art, the joke, and the sheer audacity of it all. For Schiaparelli, Daisy was the ideal client, a living canvas for her most daring ideas. Daisy's influence extended far beyond just clothes. She was a passionate and deeply knowledgeable collector of jewelry, and her taste in gems was as audacious and groundbreaking as her taste in fashion. She didn't just want big, flashy diamonds that screamed, "I'm rich." She wanted pieces that were unique, artistic, and often deeply symbolic. She didn't just buy jewelry off the shelf. She worked directly with the great jewelry houses of the Place Vendôme in Paris, particularly Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels, to commission pieces that were unlike anything seen before. Her most famous and influential piece was a spectacular creation she commissioned from Cartier in 1936. It would become known as the Tutti Frutti, or Hindu necklace. Close-up image of the Cartier Tutti Frutti necklace. It was a breathtaking, vibrant cascade of carved sapphires, emeralds, and rubies, meticulously designed to look like the lush berries, leaves, and flowers of Indian Mughal jewelry. It was a masterpiece of color, craftsmanship, and cultural fusion, and it was a radical departure from the purely diamond-centric jewelry that was popular at the time. It became her signature piece, and its influence on jewelry design can still be seen today. But she also had a darker, more surrealist taste in jewels, pieces that were designed to provoke. She worked with the visionary designer Suzanne Belperron. She commissioned a necklace from the designer Fulco di Verdura that featured blackamoor figures, rendered in gold and enamel, a choice that would be seen as deeply problematic today, but at the time was considered exotic. Her most shocking piece was perhaps a necklace designed by Jean Cocteau and made by Cartier, which depicted a pair of bleeding hands with ruby blood dripping from the fingertips. This was not the jewelry of a conventional society hostess. This was the jewelry of a provocateur, an artist, a woman who wanted her adornments to tell a story, to shock, and to command attention. Her status as the ultimate style authority was officially cemented in 1933 when she was hired by the legendary editor of American Harper's Bazaar, Carmel Snow, to be the magazine's Paris editor. It was a stroke of genius. Daisy wasn't just reporting on the latest fashions from Paris, she was creating them. Her column, often titled The Last Word from Paris, was the definitive must-read guide to what was truly chic. She had an unerring eye, an encyclopedic knowledge, and a famously sharp pen. Her pronouncements, delivered with the absolute authority of a monarch, could make or break a designer's career. It was this unique combination, a perfect minimalist canvas in her own personal dress, a deep intellectual understanding of avant-garde design, a network that gave her access to everything first, and a willingness to wear the most audacious creations with absolute unblinking confidence. That led Vogue to make its famous declaration. They called her simply the best-dressed woman in the world. It was a title she had earned, a crown she wore with pride. It gave her immense power and influence. But as her public image became more polished, more perfect, and more powerful, the darkness in her private life and in her character was beginning to fester into something truly dangerous. The same qualities that made Daisy Fellows a peerless icon of style, her sharp, uncompromising judgment, her intolerance for mediocrity, and her obsessive desire for control, also made her a deeply difficult and often profoundly cruel human being. The flawless, elegant surface she presented to the world was a meticulously crafted illusion, and it was maintained by a will of iron and a tongue like a stiletto. Her cruelty was legendary, an art form she practiced with a chilling, detached relish. Her bon mots, those witty, cutting remarks, were repeated with a mixture of horror and admiration throughout the salons of Paris and London. They were the verbal equivalent of her surrealist jewelry, designed to shock, to wound, and to assert her absolute dominance. They were rarely just funny. They were almost always aimed at a vulnerable target. She once told a woman who had the misfortune of wearing the same dress as her to a party, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm so sorry, but I really can't be seen talking to a salesgirl." Another time, The writer Beverly Nichols was a guest at one of her famously perfect dinner parties. After the meal, Daisy approached him and asked how he had enjoyed the food. Nichols, trying to be polite, replied that it was wonderful. Daisy looked at him with her piercing eyes and said, "I'm so glad you thought so. You know, you are sitting in the chair of a man who was invited last week, who complained about the food. He will never be invited again." It was a classic Daisy maneuver, a compliment wrapped around a threat, a reminder that her favor was conditional and could be withdrawn in an instant. Where did this profound, almost pathological cruelty come from? It is not hard to draw a straight line back to the abandoned 6-year-old girl whose mother had taken her own life. Her cruelty was a form of preemptive strike. It was a deeply dysfunctional defense mechanism. By hurting others first, by keeping them off balance, insecure, and desperate for her approval, she ensured that no one could get close enough to hurt or abandon her again. Her life was a constant, ruthless social war, and her wit was her most effective weapon. It was the lashing out of a deeply wounded animal dressed in the most beautiful clothes from Chanel and Schiaparelli. This emotional coldness extended most tragically to her own children. She was, by most accounts, a distant, critical, and profoundly unloving mother. She seemed to view her 4 daughters not as individuals to be nurtured, but as extensions of herself, projects to be managed, perfected, and ultimately found wanting. She was notoriously critical of their appearance, their intelligence, and their choice of husbands. She once told one of her daughters, who was not as rail thin as she was, "My dear, one can never be too rich or too thin. You are neither." Her youngest daughter, Rosamond, seemed to bear the brunt of her mother's criticism. Daisy appeared to resent Rosamond's conventional English beauty and her desire for a normal, happy life. The relationship became so toxic and so filled with psychological abuse that Rosamond would eventually suffer a complete nervous breakdown and become estranged from her mother for many years. Daisy, who had been so catastrophically abandoned by her own mother, was now perpetuating that cycle of trauma, abandoning her own children emotionally, leaving them with the same deep wounds that she carried herself. Beneath the surface of her perfectly controlled life, she was also battling serious personal demons. She became addicted to morphine and other opiates, a habit she likely picked up in the hedonistic circles of the 1920s, where drug use was often seen as a fashionable and decadent pastime. But for Daisy, it was likely more than just a party drug. It was a way to numb the persistent underlying pain of her past, a way to escape the ghosts that haunted her, a chemical tool to help her maintain the serene, untouchable facade that the world saw. The perfect, elegant creature was, in private, a drug addict, a fact that added another layer of artifice to her carefully constructed life. But the most damning aspect of her character, the one that truly pushes her into the realm of the dangerous, was her politics. As the 1930s wore on and the dark cloud of Nazi Germany gathered over Europe, Daisy Fellows, like many in her aristocratic circle, became an ardent admirer of Adolf Hitler and a vocal proponent of appeasement. Her politics were a toxic cocktail of aristocratic anti-communism, a snobbish disdain for the messiness of democracy, and a latent but undeniable strain of anti-Semitism. She believed that a strong authoritarian leader like Hitler was necessary to save Europe from what she saw as the existential threat of Bolshevism. She was a leading member of the pro-German social set that included her close friends, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who would make their famously disastrous visit to Hitler in 1937. Daisy made no secret of her views. She used her influence and her social gatherings to promote a pro-Nazi agenda. She once reportedly told a friend that what England needed was a dictator, and that Hitler was the only man for the job. Another time, as war seemed imminent, she was heard to say, "I hope for all our sakes that we don't have a war, but if we do, I hope Germany wins." This wasn't just a frivolous, chic political stance. It was a genuine ideological sympathy with one of the most evil regimes in human history. For a woman of her intelligence, influence, and international experience, it was an unforgivable moral failure. It was this aspect of her character, this willing embrace of the darkness, this complete and utter lack of a moral compass, that likely led Truman Capote to his famous verdict. A swan, in his iconography, was beautiful and graceful, but ultimately a creature of the light, often a victim of the cruel world she inhabited. Daisy Fellows was no victim. She was a predator. For all her exquisite beauty and transcendent style, she was drawn to the shadows. She was indeed too dangerous to be a swan. When war finally broke out in September 1939, the glittering international world that Daisy Fellows had ruled for 2 decades came to an abrupt and violent end. The yachts were docked, the grand houses were shuttered, and the borders slammed shut. For Daisy, who had spent her life moving effortlessly between London, Paris, and the Riviera, the new reality of a world at war was a profound shock. She spent the early part of the war in England, but her well-known pro-German sympathies made her a deeply suspect figure. She was closely watched by MI5, the British security service. Her friendship with the exiled Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who were also suspected of being Nazi sympathizers, only deepened the cloud of suspicion that hung over her. The high priestess of style suddenly found herself a social and political outcast in a London that was fighting for its life. When France fell to the Nazis in 1940, she made the controversial decision to return to her home in Paris, which was now under German occupation. Her life during the war years is shrouded in a certain amount of mystery. She maintained a relatively low profile, living in her apartment at the Ritz Hotel, a place that had become the unofficial headquarters for high-ranking German officials, including the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring. While there is no direct evidence that she actively collaborated with the occupying forces, her presence in such a compromised location and her known political leanings did little to dispel the rumors that swirled around her. The war years marked the definitive end of her reign. When Paris was liberated in 1944, the world had changed forever. The old high society she had known was gone, its members either dead, disgraced, or impoverished. A new, more democratic and less formal era was dawning. The kind of ostentatious, almost feudal display of wealth and privilege that Daisy represented was no longer fashionable. It was seen as tasteless, offensive, and a relic of a discredited past. She tried to resurrect her old life. She reopened her houses. She bought new clothes from a new generation of designers like Christian Dior. She even tried to revive her social gatherings. But the magic was gone. The world had moved on. Her pro-Nazi past clung to her like a shroud, and many of her old friends, particularly in England, now shunned her. Her style, once seen as daringly modern, now began to look brittle, severe, and out of touch with the new mood of post-war optimism. Her personal life also began to unravel completely. Her husband, Reggie Fellows, died in 1953. Her own health, ravaged by years of drug abuse and a lifetime of self-imposed discipline, began to decline. Her relationship with her daughters remained fraught with tension and bitterness. The woman who had been at the absolute center of the world for 3 decades now found herself increasingly isolated, a ghost haunting the scenes of her former triumphs. She died in her Parisian apartment on December 13th, 1962, at the age of 72. Her death was noted in the newspapers, of course. They wrote of the great style icon, the singer heiress, the legend of a bygone era, but it was an obituary for a world that no longer existed. The passing of a true cultural force was not widely mourned. The world had already, and perhaps mercifully, forgotten her. So what is the legacy of Daisy Fellows? How should we remember this complex, brilliant, and deeply flawed woman? On the one hand, her contribution to the history of fashion is undeniable. She was more than just a clothes horse. She was a true creative force. She had an eye for talent, a fearless commitment to the avant-garde, and a unique ability to transform clothes and jewels into a form of high art. She was a living, breathing modernist statement, and her influence can still be seen in the work of designers today, who prize originality and daring over simple prettiness. In an age before social media, she was the ultimate influencer, a woman whose taste dictated the direction of international style. But that is only half of the story. Her life is also a profound, cautionary tale. It's a story about the corrosive nature of immense wealth when it is untethered from a moral compass. It's a story about how catastrophic childhood trauma, if left to fester and unaddressed, can curdle a person from the inside out, creating a character that is brittle, cruel, and incapable of genuine human connection. Daisy Fellows represents the pinnacle and the dark underbelly of a certain kind of 20th century society figure, immensely privileged, exquisitely stylish, and, in the end, morally vacant. Her life, which began in the last innocent days of La Belle Époque and ended in the cynical modern world of the 1960s, is a mirror to the turbulent history of her time. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph comes from Truman Capote, the man who understood the glittering, treacherous world of high society better than anyone. His swans were beautiful and often tragic, but they were, in his eyes, ultimately tameable. They understood the rules of the game, even as they suffered from them. Daisy Fellows played by no one's rules but her own. She was a hawk in a world of swans, a predator whose elegance only made her more dangerous. Her story forces us to look past the beautiful surface and confront the uncomfortable reality that lies beneath. It is a devastating reminder that the most exquisite style cannot mask a damaged soul, and that a life dedicated to the perfection of the self can sometimes lead to the complete annihilation of it. The fire that burned within Daisy Fellows created some of the most beautiful and influential fashion images of the 20th century, but it also consumed everything and everyone in its path, leaving behind a legacy that is as dazzling as it is dark.